Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this launch event for our refreshed internal audit guidance and self-assurance toolkit. We're delighted to have with us the authors of both documents, Alex Cameron from Quinn Internal Audit and Linda Ewart is a face I'm sure most of you are all very familiar with. They're going to take us through an overview of the documents and the main changes. And if at any point you have a question you'd like to raise, you can do so in one of two ways. You can type that into the chat function, or you can use the little icon in the taskbar to raise your hand, and then I'll come round to you and ask you to unmute, and we can ask the question through your mic that way. So this is the final block of SFHA's review of existing governance guidance. And one thing I thought might be helpful to get your thoughts on today is what we should look at next. So we'll have a rolling programme of governance guidance for our members going forward. I was keen to get your views on maybe what we should be looking to cover. I'll come back to this point at the end. So maybe if there's anything that occurs to you over the course of the session, maybe if you just type that into the chat and we could come back to that. That would be really helpful and much appreciated if you could do that. And finally, just before I hand you over to Alex, I'd like to extend a huge thank you to our working group of members who considered the internal audit guidance and the toolkit. You played such a crucial part in the review, and it's been greatly appreciated, and I can't state that enough. So thank you again. So now, without further ado, I'll hand you over to Alex.
Hi everyone, lovely to see you all. If you just bear with me, I'm just going to share my screen and put up the presentation, so hopefully everything goes as planned. Let's see if we can. Can everyone see the presentation? Okay, is that showing up?
Yep, we can, Alex.
Lovely, great. So just looking around the room. Well, not the room, the virtual room. It's nice to see some familiar faces and some familiar names. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Alex Cameron. I am a Managing Director of Quinn Internal Audit and Business Support Services. So I work with a large number of RSLs throughout Scotland, providing internal audit services mainly. Do a whole bunch of other things sometimes, do various bits and pieces on governance reviews and stuff, but mainly internal audit. So I've been kindly asked by the SFHA to present the revision to the internal audit guidance to you today. Hopefully we'll be able to get you some key takeaway points, some stuff about COVID, some general understanding of the guidance, what it's for, who should be using it, what it's like, and hopefully just a better insight into internal audit, and hopefully an opportunity for you guys to ask me some questions. Hopefully nothing too difficult, but hopefully something that invites challenge and discussion. So without further ado, I'll just, with a brief introduction and to kind of lead into a little bit to Linda's presentation, just to introduce that we've really only had internal audit as a mandatory function of RSLs for just over two years now. It was brought in as part of the regulator's regulatory framework under standard 4.4. I remember rightly, I might have got that mixed up with 4.6, but it's been brought in as part of their new regulatory frameworks, which came in 2019. Obviously, that first year was the first year of doing that revised framework, that assurance statement style submission in October. And then a year later, we've had COVID. So there's been quite a bit of bumpy road to not only implementing the assurance statement, but internal audit and some of the new challenges that internal audit has faced as we've gone along. So hopefully this guidance will be able to cover off some of the risks that come out of COVID, hopefully highlight the key links that need to be in place between your internal audit provider, or whether that's internal or external internal audit, and your assurance statement returns. So just to cover off the contents of my presentation, I'll briefly talk about some of the approaches to internal audit, the changes as a result of COVID, and then complying with regulatory requirements. So thank you. So we've got, in the first part, I just thought I'd talk about the internal audit guidance briefly, give you a flavor of it for those of you that may not have read it yet or not come across it. The internal audit guidance really split into 5 sections, 5 main sections. That's probably the easiest way of thinking about it. What we would hope is that people don't usually need to read the entire document start to finish. I usually encourage clients or RSLs to read sections depending on who you are. If you're a practitioner, if you're a governing body member, it's important to just really be able to kind of dip in and out of the guidance when you need. But the 5 sections that it covers are definition of internal audit, the benefits, why you should be doing internal audit with or without compulsion. It's still a really good practice to undertake. It's part of that 3rd line of assurance, which is an independent verification of what you're doing is correct. So that can be an important part of a healthy organization. The relationship between internal and external audit, it's important to understand that there's distinct differences between what your external audit provides and what your internal audit provides. The process around selecting internal auditors and the strategies available. I think the guidance provides some guidance on tender brief and that kind of stuff in it, but basically it also gives you an idea of what professional practices your internal audit function should be adhering to, and who's the kind of good candidate to be doing your internal audit. It also covers off an in-depth look at the internal audit process itself and what kind of steps are to take on internal audit from a planning stage to a delivery outcome. And then basically the roles and responsibilities of each of the individual parties involved in the process, whether that be the internal auditors, the staff, and the governing body. It includes quick reference guides, some questions, I mentioned the tender brief, an example of an audit committee remit, in glossary terms. So hopefully some useful information in there for yourselves. And as I say, it's not something that you need to imbibe and just take on word for word, boilerplate it, but ideally cherry pick the things that you need from it, and use it as a way of getting an understanding of what good practice looks like, and be mindful that it's only guidance, it's not regulatory enforcement. The idea is that the audit program should be built around your specific needs, and I'll get on to that. So the next part we've got is just the updates, what we've updated this time around. So I thought I'd mention that the case studies and the references have been reviewed. So hopefully the references to the internal audit standards are working, Alan, and they allow for you to click through and see where the guidance comes from, where the best practice rules and regulations are cited. It includes updated references to the regulatory framework, and just how we've included a new section about how the assurance statement process should really be going hand in hand with internal audit to provide governing body members with an additional kind of level of scrutiny for them, but also assurance for them that the process is going the way it should be. And for staff, internal audit should be an opportunity for that critical friend to come in and review the process and give you the assurance that what you're putting in your assurance statement is correct. Considerations for audit programs in the wake of COVID. So remote working brings a whole bunch of challenges with it, but also invites a couple of new internal audit topics. And then considerations if you're going to use internal auditing as a remote function. Some places, some associations or cooperatives may even decide to do a blended approach to internal audit, of some remote internal auditing after the new normal, after normal returns. Just to briefly mention, to internal audit, generally you'll be composed of a risk-based audit plan, 3 to 5 years. Increasingly, over the last sort of 2.5 years, as a provider of internal audit, we've done a number of bits of work on reviewing the standards of governance for financial management. So the 7 standards. We don't tend to consult directly on that, but we've been asked to look at your evidence banks as part of the assurance statement process. And through discussion with the regulator, we've kind of highlighted that your normal risk-based internal audit program, if there should be a clear link between the audit topics, if there's any kind of failure to comply with your compliance with your standards as they relate to the audit topics. So for example, if you fail a gas safety audit or if you fail a rent arrears audit, there should be links between those findings and the assurance statement. And depending on how serious those findings are, it needs to be a discussion about whether that would impact your assurance statement. And that's a discussion that should happen between the internal auditor when they present the audit report, and when they present the audit report, and the audit committee or the governing body as they receive that report. Other things we've been involved in is internal audit can be involved in is ad hoc reviews of performance concerns. So after the pandemic, we might have seen a spike in rent arrears in some places, or there might be a huge reduction in planned maintenance spend. You might want internal audit to come and review that area ad hoc as a result of the pandemic. Follow-up reviews, we do our typical annual follow-up on old recommendations as a cyclical function, but some of the things that we've been doing involved is follow-up reviews on assurance statement actions from previous years, making sure that you've closed off all your actions from the last year as they should have been. So I just thought I'd outline briefly the role of internal audit. We sit in the 3rd line of defence. Now, for those of you that aren't so familiar with lines of defence, the 1st line of defence is in effect An internal function is part of your organization. It's your policies, procedures, risk map. It's basically the initial contact you have with risk. How do you, something is going to happen, what do you do about it? The second line of defense is basically how do you manage that risk? How do you manage that information? It tends to form part of management review, which can take place in a number of formats. So it'll be managers actually controlling risks, doing spot checks, self-assessments, and identifying controls and weaknesses and writing reports to the committee, for example. Internal audit comes in as a third line. We're the sort of first external review that comes in. We basically will pick functions, review them, and give you an objective, independent opinion that isn't provided by your management. And then just to highlight the things like external audit fit into the fourth line, and that they don't sit inside the organization in the kind of gray way that internal audit does, because of the way we review internal functions, and because we can sometimes be composed of an internal audit of an internal staff team. Sometimes we actually also sit within your organization. But for housing associations and cooperatives across Scotland, it tends to be the external provision is the way that it's done. So moving on, I just thought I'd talk briefly about audit planning. Audit plans are important, specifically as a result of COVID. We've seen changes to the way the sector is working. Remote working has obviously come in, and it has impacted on the way audit is conducted. I think it's important to consider this audit planning phase is probably one of the most important steps in general with regards to audit. We need to take in consideration risks facing the sector, risks facing your organization, your performance, regulatory and legal concerns, definitely, and corporate objectives. What are you trying to achieve? Does that align with the internal audit program? It's important that it does, because it tends to be, the things that you are doing tend to generate more risks than things that you aren't doing. The process should really involve, typically it'll be a key document review, but I think the thing to stress is that there needs to be a link from the outset, the planning stage, between internal audit and the governing body. Whether that governing body delegates its authority to an audit sub or not, that's obviously a determination that you can make within, or the committee can make, committee or board can make within their own organisation. But there needs to be a direct link between internal audit and a governing body membership. The rationale for that is because internal audit's remit or terms of reference don't relate to staff. We have close working relationships with chief execs and staff members, but ultimately we report to the governing body. And if that's established as part of the audit planning process, then we feel as if that really is beneficial and sets the rules for the play. Another important step is just determining the required resources to complete the plan. With COVID, we probably see more focus on this in the sense of just staff being available to take Zoom calls. Our staff, where our staff, are they going to be in the office to access files? Do they have the time to do the audit at that time? Is there a way we can phase the audit plan so that we get the right staff engagement at the right times? And then obviously the outcomes of previous audit work and the performance of the organisation should be baked into the audit plan. So if you've had specific areas of performance non-compliance or things change because of COVID, it's nice. The expectation would be to see those topics being built into the audit plan from the outset. If I move on to the next one, number of days is something I get asked about all the time. It came up in this revision of guidance. I've spoken to the Institute of Internal Audit, I've spoken to the regulator. We're not prescribing a number of days for a decent internal audit program. I think that's not the right way to think about it. When I actually sat down and thought about number of days, there's a couple of things that I kind of took into consideration. And one thing dawned on me is that clients tend to buy different numbers of days in different years over a 3-year program. So when we give an average number of days per client, it doesn't really mean a lot because it's only really a snapshot of a number of days in a given year. So I find it very difficult to give you the right number of days to buy because it's going to depend on your provider. It's going to depend on how many areas you need to audit it. It's going to depend on how much you want audited over 3 years. There's a whole bunch of different things that feed into it. So rather than do that, I've kind of dodged the question and given you some open-ended questions that maybe think about when you speak to your internal auditors, which are, do we review enough areas within the organization to give the required assurance? So by that, what I mean is the number of topics. Is there enough coverage in the internal audit plan that actually is 2 topics a year is that suitable for an organization of our size? Should it be 4 topics? Should it be a topic per quarter? Do we need more than that? Is there a contingency topic built into our plan? Do we engage with each area of the business over the 5 or 3 year audit plan? Is there anywhere in the 3 or 5 year plan that's basically a stone left unturned? The next thing I like to think about is the number of days per audit. Do these number of days per audit, do they allow the internal auditors to dig deep enough? I suppose that as an internal audit provider, I'm always going to encourage you to buy more audit. It's an ever-present bias. But depending on the auditor doing your work, depending on your audit team, depending on their composite day rate, do you get enough on-site fieldwork audit out of them that it's going to give you the depth of investigation you require? So is the sample size they're looking at representative of what the information you're giving them is? So are they, if you give them 10,000 allocations and they pick 10, is that a representative level of depth that would give you assurance? Probably not. Third, is for the governing body, are we providing enough resources to the internal auditors to allow them to provide us with a quality service? So this is a kind of a blended combination of, are we letting them review enough topics? Are we being candid with them? Are we giving them a number of days that gives them, satisfies them? It's an important thing to remember that internal audit, to some extent, is guided by your governing body. So the governing body should be asking some of these questions themselves and be engaging with the auditors to say to them, as our provider, are you comfortable that the number of days allocated is going to make you happy? And if you're happy, are we happy? If the more audit work that the internal auditors do, and the deeper dive that it is, in theory, the happier your governing body should be. As I say, this kind of came out in discussion with the regulator to some extent. Their view is that you shouldn't be scared to spend money on internal audit. I'm inclined to agree with them, despite my bias. But the point I would make is that the costs down the road of non-compliance or failure to deploy good scrutiny will probably be much more severe. Things like regulatory involvement or engagement tend to be much more expensive than a couple of extra audit days in your audit plan. Changes as a result of COVID. So I think these are self-explanatory slides to some extent, so I'll be brief, but the idea is that we've moved to Zoom, case in point in this presentation, we've got WebEx, Teams, whatever it is, probably been using some sort of video conferencing. The challenge for audit, and I think the challenge for yourselves is going to be around about this idea that previously I could have just popped my head around a door and asked somebody directly, well, what's this? Where's that? Who does this? But now we're in a situation where, as convenient as this is, are we getting the same level of evidence, and can we provide the same level of challenge? And I would agree with those two statements, and I think video conferencing and video remote audit does provide that. But the issue that I highlight is that, do we get the same level of engagement? And that's something I think is still out for discussion, partly because I think that some of the context around information can be lacking. As an external reviewer, it takes longer to kind of read through information. It's harder to cherry pick the key controls out. I need to spend longer talking to people. So on balance, I'm not sure that video conferencing is the panacea to all our problems. So I'm kind of encouraging ourselves, to be prepared to do more work in some ways around documenting notes, context, evidence, and documents, because it's fine and well to give an external reviewer a pack information, but if they don't understand the context of how that was remotely agreed, you might not pass the test of muster. So something to bear in mind when thinking about using various remote working methodologies. Some of the risks that I just thought I'd highlight as part of COVID that I've seen. So chairing can be challenging. We can see, technological problems can isolate the non-tech savvy board members or governing body members. Sometimes meetings can run on because it takes longer for people to speak. Hands up systems can just make meetings run on longer. I've seen, looking at Zoom, personal experience, looking at Zoom screens can create mental fatigue. People aren't as engaged in meetings as they should be. Security concerns around just IT controls, this combined with working from home, people isolated, being exposed to new risks or new opportunities to do things they wouldn't normally do. GDPR concerns around about, how is personal data being accessed in the remote workplace. Less cultural feel within organizations, strong working teams, now contacting each other through remote practice. That has been managed well, but I think there's just this inherent need to be in the room with other staff to really improve working culture. Slower working practices, I kind of mentioned. It takes longer to verify information. If, for example, a document needs a retype or a typo, you can't just go over to someone and say, hey, can you just adjust that? You've got to then send it back and forward a couple of times. Increased workload, breakdown of routine. Over-reporting on COVID tends to be a risk that sometimes come across when looking at assurance statements from an internal audit perspective. Is most of you will probably be on recovery plans by now, but I suppose it's just something to be mindful of, that at the end of the day, we're providing housing and looking after tenants' priorities. And although COVID is an element of that, there is a certain aspect of trying to get back to business as usual as quick as possible. Some of the other informational issues that can come up from audit is reporting templates and formats for your, whether it be board papers, whether it be regular reports or performance reports, might not have been designed for presentations on video conferencing. So it might be difficult to transition those into a remote working format. Positives though, just to balance out, I've definitely seen more engagement with governing body members. It's easier to attend meetings. You can attend a training session like this one, and stay where you are. It's great. Commute's been cut down. Opportunity to streamline processes. So as part of internal audit, we've been working with associations and co-ops to look at what they currently do in terms of whether it be payment processes or if it would be letting processes, to how you can streamline those processes down in your policy and procedures so that we don't have to do all this back and forth, sending a pro forma there and getting it back and all this kind of stuff. Work-life balance, we're kind of in a new normal now. I think everyone will accept there's probably some discussion around about there's a new culture working. And then basically the push towards the use of technology. I've seen a lot of clients moving towards using technology previously where they might not have been, and this has been a nudge in the right direction. And then there's obviously a new engagement opportunities for tenants to engage with ourselves generally through SurveyMonkey or remote working groups, that kind of stuff. From an internal audit perspective, things that you should be asking of your internal auditors, I would suggest during your kind of program is, within our organization, have we had any controls that have been reduced or turned off? So is there something, excuse me, just, are there things we normally do that we don't now do? Do we double check the invoices as thoroughly as we used to? Do we double, triple check the rent accounts like we used to? Are the reconciliations done the same way? I'm not picking on finance, those are just the examples I can think of at the moment, but is there anything to the way that we work that we don't do now because it's easier to not do because we're remote, where we would have done it in person? Is there any money that's going out the door? Are we buying anything going out the door that's new as a result of COVID that we wouldn't have normally bought? Is that something that we should be buying? Is that something that in effect we can control the expenditure of? Is there anything that's procurement wise that are the delegated authorities around procurement and the procurement streams, are those appropriate for remote authorization? It could be that you might have staff in the office and they can just ask their line manager, hi, is it okay if I authorize £1,000 on this repair? And that process can happen in real time. But if you're working remotely, their delegated authorities, it might still be, their authority might be 1,000, but is it appropriate for them to be sat in their house on their own, allowed to authorize as much as that? Delivery of product, delivery methods are the right, is information going to the right people? Is everybody CC'd in? Is mail going to the right people? Is it being distributed correctly? Our product, are things that the association buys going to the right people, right places? How are you managing fraud and error risk? So fraud is obviously self-explanatory, but error is probably more common. I think the risks around fraud and error are ever present. We've seen, because of remote working, people tend to make more mistakes with GDPR, emails going the wrong places, documents getting sent to the wrong people, simply because people are on the computer more often. Are these types of errors and frauds being logged? Is there an understanding of what kind of is there been an uptick in errors or even fraud as a result of remote working? Are you tracking that? Have you done a risk assessment to evaluate, are your fraud and policies in place that are they fit for purpose as a result of remote working? If you look back on the remote working period, was there any gaps in the way that when you switched over, you would have liked to have closed those gaps? Have lessons been learned? And has the association or cooperatives risk appetite for losses and fraud as the association's appetite or risk appetite changed as a result of COVID? Are you willing to take more risk for more reward? Something to think about. Is there any changes to the risk profile of the association or co-op as a result of these new working practices? So these are all discussions you can kind of have with your internal auditor about where the association or co-op is, ourselves at. Are there any kind of lessons to be learned from the pandemic? I think past crises have shown us that during the middle of an incident tends to be an opportune moment for fraudsters or opportunists to take advantage. I think the increase in direct debit fraud is something that I've seen with a couple of clients actually. We've seen because tenants are now, either on universal credit in ever increasing numbers. Some of them are paying their rent more directly. There's been an increase in false direct debits being set up on rent accounts and stuff. So are you tracking that kind of stuff? Are you aware of it? Things to talk to your internal audit about. Good controls, I should say, can be deliberately bypassed for efficiency during pandemics or during crises. So have you done anything that was just, you decided, oh, it's easier if we just don't do that? And the reason to bring this up is because it's probably been done for good reasons. What can happen is that control is never reenacted. So you might have a process which requires you to do Y, and that's very easy to do when you've got everyone in the office. But when everyone's at home, it's not really that easy to do it. But when everyone comes back into the office, are these controls being reinstated? And as you're part of your internal audit plan, as you review your normal operations and your normal audit topics, are you aware that these controls have been turned off, or that they're no longer effective, or that they're inadequate? And should internal audit be aware of that? Other things are just fairly straightforward. I think the internal audit plans as part of the pandemic should be looking at IT security controls. Has the lack of employee engagement and experience with has people's lack of experience with remote working and using internet communication methods been impacted? Has that impacted on the organization's performance? Have people been able to get access to the right information? Have they been able to use the same access controls? Are their passwords and procedures being complied with? Do you still have the same segregation of duties when many people are away from the office or are furloughed? So some organizations might have furloughed key staff, and some of those key staff might have been people who authorized payments. So you might have been left with only 1 or 2 people to authorize payment batches. Have those batches been reviewed? Have those processes been signed off as complete and separate? In future, I think internal auditors will need to basically focus on a few areas just in addition to what we currently look at. If you're going to go for a blended approach or remote working in the future, that should be blended into your internal audit plan, and the scope of each of the reviews should include some reference to the remote working practice. I think factors such as team morale, the mindset, communication in teams is really important. We've seen that the ability for some teams to work, housing management teams tend to work very well using WhatsApp. They like the more frequent communication of that. Finance teams have been able to silo themselves off and basically work very effectively remotely. But is that going to continue on indefinitely? That would need to be reviewed as an ongoing part of your internal audit plan. As internal audit, we probably expect that if the internal audit is going to be conducted remotely, there needs to be a kind of confirmation of the report findings with the client up front, because it's difficult to gauge body language and context, as I mentioned, around findings with just a written report. So if the report's straightforward and the draft is straightforward, it can be okay to issue just the draft. However, if there's more complex findings, it's better if you get speak to your internal auditors via remote conferencing before they finish writing out the report, so that you can discuss the context of the findings and get an agreement as to the final written word. Normally, when you're speaking to somebody face to face, you can have a bit more of a feel, an understanding of the way the words are going to be written. But with remote working, it's difficult, especially when draft reports are being issued. The next thing to think about is just generally, I've found with internal audit in the last year or so, there's been a need to increase materiality. Materiality really means, decreased materiality, i.e. Internal audit needs to be looking in more detail and basically testing out stress, more extreme stress, worst case scenarios as part of the internal audits. This is simply because we've seen just a change to working habits, which can impact on controls. So we need to be able to do looking at things in more detail to be able to pick up any changes that might have occurred as a result of these remote working arrangements. The idea that materiality will vary depending on the audit is true, but I think it's important that, again, going back to my original point about sufficiently resourcing internal audit, it might be the case that you get you might be able to do a more efficient internal audit remotely, but it might take longer to do it because your internal auditor will have to go into more detail and look at more remote documentation to kind of give you the same level of assurance. The next thing is just making sure that, as I mentioned, that the organization is resilient to circumvention and fraud. So I would advise nearly all of you to kind of have a look at how you managed the pandemic, what were your lessons learned, what can you take out of it. I suspect most of your business continuity plans probably weren't used. Business continuity used to focus on relocating to another fixed location and opening up a new office, but in a pandemic, you can't really do that. So understanding your controls, your remote working controls, and understanding what worked is going to be very important. And I suspect you could probably take most of that and rebuild a business continuity plan that allows you much more flexibility, and you don't have to rely on fixed offices or fixed premises. And then finally, your internal auditor should just basically be, as part of this year's, probably to some extent, or next year's audit plans, just looking at the RSL's operations. If you do decide to sort of have a review of home working, and if that's going to form part of your organization, maybe speak to your internal auditors about that and just give them the heads up that the operations or the way that some of your working practices currently are might change, and then hopefully they'll be able to build that into the new internal audit plan. And then there's just some of the points I'd made earlier, but basically internal audit's role at the crisis, we will be taking, from our side anyway, we'll be taking into consideration as part of the audit plans going forward, is the ability of managers to make appropriate decisions during times of stress. So for a lot of clients that I've been working with recently, I've been doing business continuity reviews with the kind of prefix of looking at how they managed COVID and how those lessons learned have been taken forward, and how appropriate the decisions that management took during a period of stress, how appropriate those decisions were. And that basically involves looking through, the last year's worth of management committee or board reporting, and making sure that the typical governance controls in place haven't been stressed or haven't been circumvented. So things like delegated authority, for example. Other things that internal audit should be taken into consideration, again, is cultural concerns, financial resilience and liquidity. I suspect most RSLs actually have come out of the pandemic with reasonably good cash balances, and cash flow has actually been relatively good, partly due to delays in asset spend and reactive spends. But it's important that we make hay while the sun is shining. But in the next coming years, we might see high inflation. If you've got development, material costs may increase. So making sure that your cash flows and your financial planning and liquidity is all up to date is a really important part of stress testing the business plan. And I think coming out of the pandemic, something that nearly everyone should be looking at. Dependencies on suppliers and third parties. So just reviewing your suppliers, how did they perform during COVID? Do you have any third party engagements, that were stressed? Probably local authorities, care provision, that kind of stuff. How did those relationships handle the pandemic? Is there anything you could learn from that? Is there any kind of weaknesses in those channels of communication? I'd mentioned business continuity. And obviously, I don't want to stress too much, but we wouldn't be here without ICT management systems. So it's always important to keep up to date. I think a lot of clients have been doing cyber essentials, and that had been going on as part of just a kind of an update across the sector about standards in ICT. But a lot of our clients are also going for a Cyber Essentials Plus, which is the more involved version. So I would kind of encourage as many of you to do that as possible, as I think that's a really worthwhile endeavor and relatively low cost if you procure it right. Just regulatory compliance. I just wanted to talk about assurance statement stuff and just some of the things that I quite like to see in assurance statements. So I won't hopefully step on Linda's toes too much, but the internal audit should be involved with your governing body. I guess mainly at the planning stage, but sometimes as your internal auditor, I've been involved in focus groups with various RSLs, talking to them about their standard evidence banks and making sure that they're comfortable with the assurance framework. As I say, it's not necessarily internal audit that would do this, but consultants, or it could be staff led, they could also be involved. I think it's just important that the governing body gets a third party assurance around about their evidence bank to make sure that, you know, what we're pulling together is evidential. It can be verified by, you know, it looks reasonable to a third party, and it passes that sort of acid test. A key part of a productive internal relation, a key thing to consider when with a productive internal auditor is just that they have a relationship with the governing body. One of the key things that we do as part of our annual process with clients is we tend to have depending on the setup of the client, but we try and have an annual meeting with governing body members. Sometimes I think the regulatory framework says that an appropriate relationship should be maintained between auditors and governing body members, but we like to do an in-camera session with governing body members so that if there's anything that the governing body want to ask us, then they can do without the pressure of staff being there. It tends not to reveal any kind of big, scary, you know, exciting things, but it's just a good opportunity so that the board or the committee feel comforted that they can speak to the auditor directly without staff being there. I would also encourage your internal audit providers to include you know, I'm sure they will, but on the front cover of our reports, we put on my contact details and just a note to say if governing body members read the report and they want to speak to me, then that's something that they can do at their leisure. The next thing is just some of the work that sometimes I do is asking executive officers, so staff, to pull together the compliance matrices and the toolkits, things like the work Linda does. And then as internal audit, we just review the process to make sure that that's operating as expected annually. Governing bodies, we would expect as part of the internal audit review, or as just, you know, as part of even just the in-camera meetings, is that the governing bodies have a chance to discuss the outcomes from their toolkits and their matrices with external reviewers. Are they comfortable that they know what's going on with their assurance statement? And if they have any concerns around any of those processes, then they can always discuss it, or, I mean, I hate to use it, not whistleblow, but can discuss it with their internal audit provider. And then a point that I think the regulator is quite keen to stress is that internal audit reports from your annual plan, you might not necessarily audit the assurance statement directly, but if there's any areas where internal audit has found poor performance or non-compliance and it's running into the serious or limited assurance areas, then it's appropriate for internal audit to have a discussion with the governing body about the materiality of those findings and whether or not they will affect your annual assurance statement return at the end of the year. So, sorry, in October. So if you fail disastrously in an internal audit, there needs to be linkage between that poor performance being identified, the outcomes of that, and whether or not that's material enough to be put into your assurance statement. As I say, the important sort of steps are that staff provide the evidence, the governing body should be challenging it, and internal audit is a tool that assists them challenge. Just some things that I think are important to mention. Generally speaking, with COVID, we've seen, thankfully, the initial year of insurance work has been done using face-to-face. And some associations and clubs have actually been very good hyperlinking information and building very, very competent databases for their assurance statements. So technologically, I would advise RSLs to have a well laid out logical evidence base that can be accessed remotely, because we never know when another pandemic might hit, but also just for the simple fact that as an auditor, it's very easy to engage with clients who've got well laid out assurance statement evidence that fits into a nice database that I can kind of click into and just review the key documents straight off the bat. Another thing is that I try and advise people to do is to don't roll actions over year to year from your assurance statement. If you've found things that need to be improved, I think it's just in your best interest to try and get those done within the year prior to the next assurance statement review. Other things to consider: the impact assessment. It's just an overall review of corporate policies to make sure that COVID-19 and the remote working arrangements have been taken into consideration for your corporate policies. It's good for us as auditors because we tend to start off looking at your policy and procedure, and it's nothing that's frustrating as when we read policy and procedure and it has absolutely no bearing on the actual process we're reviewing. So if there has been major changes to things like the processes, the way the organization works, it's really helpful if these can be documented in policy and procedure before the auditors come out. Good things, good practice that we've seen is focus groups can be helpful, and it's good to get your internal auditors involved in some of these focus groups. I've enjoyed working with some RSLs. I find that if we do video conferencing, it can be on real days, so focus groups kind of help with that. It's good sometimes and comforting, I think, for some governing body members to have their internal auditors discuss that year's work and give their opinions on what they've seen across the sector. I find that committees and subcommittees and governing body members like to ask me questions about what have I seen elsewhere, what's good practice, and when they review their regulatory standards, if I'm there, I can sometimes give them guidance on kind of the level of information that I'd like to see in the evidence bank. And then the final 2 points are ensuring that the role of internal audit is well understood in the organization, that internal audit is not a compliance check, but also an opportunity for improvement. So the more candid you are with internal audit, it tends to be the better results you get. It's also important that the governing body really understand that internal audit is their tool and they should take full ownership of that tool. And they can just redirect that tool at their discretion. So it's really important that everyone knows the role of internal audit, so that we can be best used. And then finally for this slide is clear tracking, clear actions tracking. So when recommendations are made from internal audit, one of the areas is that I see people fall down is that if they're not recorded appropriately and not regularly refreshed and reviewed as part of the performance report of, say, an audit committee, then that can become an area of weakness. It's all fine and well and getting good recommendations, but there really needs to be a follow-up and an understanding of those recommendations over time so that you can get them ticked off. And then the final slide I've got before questions is just that internal audit needs to be kind of kept abreast of events within your organization. Sometimes I know that the day-to-day firefighting things, but it's been important throughout COVID for clients to keep us updated of their notifiable events, especially prior to assurance statement submissions. If you do have notifiable events, it can be a reasonably good idea to get internal audit to kind of have a think about, is that a process that needs reviewed? What got you into a notifiable event situation? I tend to advise clients it's better to fix it yourself than to be fixed by someone else. Internal audit can assist you in determining if issues are material or not. So given that we go to a whole range of different RSLs across Scotland or wherever, depending on who your provider is, they can help you work out if an issue is material or not, and should it be in your assurance statement or not. Evidence banks and internal audit reports should be made fully available to governing body members. I think the idea behind this is just simply that things like board reporting software have been really important during COVID. I think boards, being a governing body member myself, I find it really useful to have a portal that I can log into and see board papers. The hard copy stuff getting mailed out during COVID and pandemic can be a little tricky. getting members up to speed with, you know, bulletins or kind of in rush of the moment papers. If you're issuing them electronically, it's them a lot quicker and can be better organized, I find. And then I think just some of the final key points, just the internal audit and the assurance reporting framework. Internal audit provides assurance. Your assurance framework is your assurance framework. So the two should go hand in hand and be interlinked and reference each other as much as possible. And then that's really it. So the government body understands the role and that they're able to understand that the internal auditor is their tool to help them get the information they need and hopefully be able to sleep at night. So finally, just questions. Hopefully I've covered everything that you ever desired to know about internal audit. If not, please feel free to ask questions and I'll do my best to answer.
Thanks for that, Alex. Thanks very much for that, Alex. We've had a few suggestions in the chat for areas that we might want to look at in a future governance guidance programme, which I'll come back to at the end, but please keep those coming. And maybe now if we move on to Linda.
So, hello everybody. Now we've just got a bit of technological switching to do here.
Oh, yeah, let me, how do I stop sharing? There we are. Okay, that should be.
Stop sharing and then we'll start sharing again. So if you can just bear with me for a moment, please. Okay. Didn't work. Okay, are we good to go, everyone?
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Linda.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. It's very nice to know that so many people have come along, and I hope this is useful. What I've decided to do in terms of the launch of the version 3 of the SFHA self-assurance, well, combined version, combined production of the self-assurance toolkit is not to go through it, I'm sure you'll be pleased to know, on a page-by-page basis and say, well, we've changed this and we've updated that and we've deleted this word, because I decided that that wouldn't be very useful, and actually it wouldn't take very long, because version 3 of the toolkit looks remarkably like version 2 because there have been relatively minor, well, not minor, but minimal updates to the text of the document. So what I want to do is a wee bit like what Alex has done, which is to talk a bit more generally about assurance and the part it plays in demonstrating compliance, but also delivering good governance. And as with the previous presentations, I'm happy to just either, if you want to interrupt, that's grand, but we can hold questions till the end and come back to things. So, thought I would take as my starting point what the governing body needs to do, and I suppose this is where there's a bit of a, well, there's quite a lot of links between what Alex has said and what I'm going to talk about, but absolutely the governing body needs to be in the driving seat of the assurance process. And I guess before I go too much further, I would want to just talk a wee bit about this word process and the concept of assurance being a process. Because I have to admit that I've become a bit worried about that context and that terminology, because it seems to me that there is a risk that the annual assurance statement becomes an objective in itself, rather than continuous assurance within an organisation being a kind of ongoing environment that a well-governed, well-managed, well-functioning, compliant organisation exists within. So the annual assurance statement is an externally imposed requirement, which needs to be fulfilled in terms of your role as a registered social landlord. But it seems to me that that is really just an annual demonstration of what you are doing as a well-governed, well-managed, well-functioning organisation. And so I think it's quite important that we begin to move away from a discussion around assurance being a process to more of a discussion around what do we need to do in order to ensure that we are assured that things are as good as we think they are. And internal audit is one of the strands that comes to bear on that process. Because assurance is what the governing body needs to have in order to be satisfied that the organisation that they are leading and directing does all the things that are listed on this slide. So that is complying with the regulatory standards of governance and financial management, complying with the requirements of the Charter, meeting all of its statutory and regulatory requirements, understanding where there are gaps or failings, and being clear about what's required to meet or address those gaps or failings, but also, really importantly, being aware of whether or not those gaps or failings matter. Now, can you imagine a lot of people are getting a wee bit twitchy about, well, of course they matter. If there are gaps or failings, of course they matter. I think this is where the whole issue of materiality comes in and the context of an organisation comes in, because assurance should be absolutely rooted in a firm understanding of the purpose of the organisation, the operating environment that you exist within, and the objectives that you're trying to deliver. And so it's sometimes a kind of minor deviation from the letter of a requirement might look like a gap or a failing, but actually it doesn't matter, because you're still delivering against all the key requirements that you have set yourselves and that have been set by others. So I think that's an important point to get over. The governing body does need to know where those gaps or failings represent risks to the organisation or where they represent actual failure on the part of an organisation to do what you've said you're going to do. And therefore there needs to be an identification and an implementation of remedies. And I think the point that Alex made during his presentation about being clear where improvements are required and not rolling things over from one year to another is really important, because I think if you do have that kind of treadmill approach to things, then assurance does become a process rather than a state of the organisation's activity. So being very clear about what you need to do to improve things, but as importantly, or possibly more importantly, being clear about what the purpose of the improvement is, and how you will measure success and sustain that improvement. As you're probably all aware, the toolkit distinguishes between actions for improvement that are identified during the course of the assurance environment and actions required for compliance. And obviously compliance actions are the ones that are really essential. They're the ones that have to have the highest priority, and they're the ones that will have potentially an impact on the status that you record in terms of compliance with the external standards that you are setting out to be measured against or to measure yourselves against. The governing body needs to have evidence to support its conclusions. So if a governing body is going to determine at any point in the year whether or not it is assured that the organisation is compliant, so that needs to be evidence-based. It can't just be based on, well, things seem all right, we think things are okay. There needs to be evidence. And I think, again, the point that Alex made about accessible evidence banks, which governing body members can dip into, go to at any given point in the governance year and check, or just root around and have a look at information that's there, whether it's KPIs or internal audit reports or benchmarking information or survey results, because all of these things contribute to the assurance that an organisation has. So accessible evidence banks are, I think, key to good governance and key to strong assurance. They are maintained collaboratively. I think it's really important that we don't think about the evidence bank as being something that's full of a whole lot of information that is produced specifically for the purpose of an annual assurance statement. The evidence bank should be a gathering together of all of the documents and resources and tools that an RSL uses to sustain good governance. So things like performance reports, like board reports, like tenant survey reports, like internal audit reports and programmes, external audit reports, specialist reports about cyber security or about tenant or resident safety, or about tenant engagement, any of these kinds of things. Staff welfare, pick something topical just now given the impact of the pandemic and remote working, staff welfare, those kinds of reports should all form part of the evidence bank, but clearly linked to the relevant regulatory standards, because there needs to be clarity about what what and how the evidence bank supports assurance about compliance. One of my big bugbears, I have to say, is when I'm asked to look at an evidence bank and it's just a melee of documents. It's just a whole lot of stuff, minutes. So we look at standard 1 that talks about effective governance structures, and there's a whole lot of minutes from meetings. They might have been from years ago, or they might be up to date, and there's no connection about, well, this minute is there to demonstrate compliance or to give us assurance about compliance because it talks about X, Y, or Z. So it's really important that there are clear lines to link the evidence and the purpose for which it's there, what it's actually helping to give assurance to the governing body about in terms of compliance. And so the evidence bank is really key. I think it's important to stress that officers have a huge part to play in the construction and maintenance of the evidence bank. But it should be a collaborative approach between officers and governing body members, because governing body members need to be satisfied that the evidence bank contains all the information that they feel that they need in order to be assured. And that might vary from one organisation to another. Internal audit or external specialists have a role to play in providing an assessment about how robust the evidence bank is, but in terms of the sources of assurance, that really has to be driven by the governing body and officers working in partnership. And you then use all of that to confirm and report to the Scottish Housing Regulator and other stakeholders, because of course other organisations or agencies have an interest in whether or not an organisation is compliant. And I know that the toolkit looks very daunting. It's 100 and odd pages of text with loads and loads of hyperlinks that take you to all sorts of, we hope, useful reference tools and documents. But I'm part of the gang that is a bit frustrated sometimes when I end up with a whole lot of open tabs on my computer, trying to flick my way through between one and the other. I think Alex made the point about the internal audit guidance not being intended to be sat down and read from front to back, cover to cover, with a cup of tea and a biscuit. And the toolkit is in exactly the same category. I think it's there to be used on a dip in and dip out basis. And I think it's there to be used as organisations see fit. One of the most effective ways, I think, for the toolkit to be used is by perhaps focus groups of the governing body working together with specific members of staff, officers, to look at things maybe on a standard by standard basis, and to use the self-assessment factors as reflective questions to support a discussion about, is the evidence that we have gathered giving us the assurance that we think we need? And if it's not, what can we do to supplement that? Is it about gathering in different evidence, or is it about doing things differently? But there's no expectation or intention that the toolkit is worked through on an annual basis over a 3-month period from start to finish. Because I think if you were to do that, it becomes a process and it becomes routine and it's not very valuable. So it's really important that things are done in a way that suits the organisation. Probably prompts me just to remind everyone that it's not a prescriptive document either. It's there as a toolkit for people to use as they see fit, or to put on a shelf and to use something different, a different approach that's maybe bespoke to your own organisation. So it's not intended to be prescriptive. The other thing that I would want to say too is that we're now, Alex made the point, we're now at the 3rd year, year 3 of annual assurance statements and the whole new framework of assurance and evidence banks. And when the regime was introduced in its a few years ago, there was some guidance that was published. It was I think a thematic study from the Scottish Housing Regulator that talked about a 3-year cycle for review. That doesn't figure in the guidance anywhere now or in the regulatory framework. And that's one of the changes that we've made in version 3 of the toolkit, because we've taken out the reference to a 3-yearly review. Because I think as organisations have begun to embed assurance systems, processes, approaches into the way they do things, that idea of a 3-year cycle seems to be less relevant, because some aspects of some standards are being reviewed continuously, others it's a longer term game. So that's something that has been tweaked a wee bit. So moving on, in 2021, there are some specific things that assurance needs to do in addition to the generality, which is what this slide is about. And I think, again, that's a point that Alex made that I would echo, that assurance is about sustaining the business in the long term, maintaining the organisation's delivery of the objectives that you're there to achieve. And pandemic factors have to be added on, but they shouldn't dominate, and they shouldn't drive what you're doing unnecessarily. So in 2021, assurance, the annual assurance statement will have to reflect the work that you are doing over the course of the year, to take into account the impact of the last year and the last 15 or 16 months on all aspects of compliance and planning and service delivery. And specifically, there is an expectation, as there was last year, to identify any areas of material non-compliance that are due to the pandemic. So, for example, not being able to have 100% gas safety compliance, if that's due to vulnerable tenants shielding and not wanting contractors in their properties. Similarly, for essential repairs, if there's something like that you've been unable to do. And that's almost as a mitigation. We haven't met, we know we're not compliant here, but actually we've done everything we possibly can to deliver compliance, and it's factors beyond our control that mean that we are not compliant. And I think that's really important for the organisation itself, and that's where the benefit of the assurance framework comes into play, because assurance should be of value to individual RSLs before it does anything for any other party. And if all the assurance exercise does is satisfy external requirements, then it's not being done properly, in my view, by an RSL. It has to deliver value and benefit to you internally first, and because there has to be some meaningful benefit for it to be worthwhile. Apart from anything else, if it doesn't do that, you're not going to drive forward the improvements that you've identified as part of the exercise anyway. So in terms of identifying, for example, areas of non-compliance that are due to COVID, my advice would be that you have to be assured that you have done everything you possibly can, and you continue to do everything you possibly can to achieve compliance in any area that you are reporting non-compliance due to the pandemic, and that you continue to do that. And if as a result of this exercise you discover we could be doing something differently here that would deliver a different outcome, then that's the benefit to you as an organisation, and more importantly to your tenants. Specifically in 2021, assurance has to consider the preparations for the new duties that are being introduced in relation to equalities data collection and implementing a human rights approach to your activities. And I think this is one of the areas where we've had quite a long lead-in time, because the equalities data collection requirement duty was signalled back in 2018 when the new framework was introduced, but it was deferred to allow for the production of guidance. The guidance is not yet available, as I'm sure you are all aware, but what we have done in the toolkit is to anticipate the guidance having been published, because the expectation is that the guidance will have been published before before the deadline for the submission of the 2021 annual assurance statement. Because, just to jump to the end, the framework, the timescale has been has reverted back this year to what we to the first year, which is that the annual assurance statement has to be submitted by the 31st of October. So the expectation, as published by the regulator last week for the 2021 annual assurance statement, is that this year there will be specific mention of the arrangements that RSLs are making to move towards compliance. Some RSLs have already submitted an annual assurance statement for 2021, because as you're probably all aware, the requirement is to submit the statement between April and the 31st of October in any 1 year. For those organisations which have already submitted an annual assurance statement before the publication of the guidance, there will be an expectation that they then submit something of a supplementary nature that specifically looks at the preparations that are being made to achieve compliance with the equalities and human rights requirements. We can come back to that in the questions if that would be helpful. Additionally, in 2021, I think it's important that RSLs consider whether or not it is feasible, if you haven't already done so, to adopt the 2020 model rules. And I think this is where certainly all been a bit taken aback. She says, mistress of understatement, all been a bit taken aback at how long the pandemic has prevailed, and the continuing impact that it has on everything that everyone tries to do. And last year, about 50% of housing associations, RSLs, co-ops, managed or chose to take steps to adopt the 2020, the new model rules that SFHA published around about this time last year. That leaves 50% of RSLs which are constituted under the pre-2020 model rules, and who probably don't have provisions in their rules for the holding of virtual meetings. So there are pressures on to consider whether or not it is feasible to adopt the new model rules in the course of this year, given the restrictions that might or might not still prevail come August or September. The current situation in terms of regulatory compliance is that RSLs are expected to adopt the new rules as soon as possible, but there's no definition as to what as soon as possible might mean. But that's something just to be aware of in terms of the overlay of 2021. So moving on then to toolkit version 3, made some of these points already. Advice and guidance is not a prescriptive and it's not a checklist. Please remember that it is not a checklist. It's not a formula that is just worked through. It's something that has to be specific and bespoke to an individual organisation. There are some what might be called minor updates and amendments to the toolkit, and generally speaking, they fall into a few categories. One, to deal with equalities and human rights, and because we've added in some additional self-assessment factors to some of the areas to reflect that. We've tightened, well, maybe not tightened up, we've made more specific some of the self-assessment factors. For example, in respect of the 2018 fire safety regulations, the version of the toolkit last year talked about do we have a deliverable strategy to achieve compliance. This year, the self-assessment factor has been expanded to include a pointer to say, we've got a strategy and is it being implemented effectively? And that probably gives an illustration of how the toolkit can be used to support the work that you're doing internally anyway. Because by looking at these self-assessment factors and just pausing and asking the question, well, we've got the strategy, is it being implemented effectively? How do we know that it's being implemented effectively? Is the reporting arrangements that are in place, are they good enough to give us as governing body members the assurance that we need that the targets that we've set are being achieved and that the properties that we're responsible for letting are compliant or are going to be compliant by the time that we need to? And given where we are just now, are there unreasonable or unnecessary risks attached to any slowdown in the process and or the consequences of the delay? Added in some changes to reflect the provisions, as I've mentioned already, about the model rules. We've also added in or alerted people to the publication of the new codes of conduct and updated EPB, entitlements, payments and benefits policy, and the bringing together of all the requirements in terms of declarations of interest. And we have flagged in a couple of points in the guidance the importance of making sure that policies that are being used within organisations cross-refer to specifics like the code of conduct, like the EPB policy. So, for example, in terms of a procurement policy, are you confident that the procurement policy cross-refers to the need to ensure that registers of interest are kept up to date and that declarations of interest are actively managed and that conflicts are monitored and avoided? We've also I'm just trying to remind myself about some of the things that we've amended. We've also tried to make more realistic some of the, or one of the self-assessment or self-assessment factors relating to succession planning for governing body members, particularly in terms of the 9-year rule, where we've tidied up the language to flag up to committee members, to board members, the importance of basing decisions about whether or not the nomination of someone who has completed 9 or more years service in the role, and whether or not that nomination should be allowed to go ahead, basing that decision on the outcome of the annual board reviews or effectiveness assessments. And the purpose of doing that is, 1, to make it a bit more useful, but 2, to prompt then the ongoing discussion about how do we use our annual assessments, how do we use our annual appraisals, do we get feedback as a governing body member that enables us to assess where we are in terms of succession planning, in terms of planning for office roles, in terms of recruitment and selection, and how do we make use of that information. And I think that picks up on some of what Alex was saying about the importance of there being engagement between all of those people who are involved in assurance. It's not an exercise that should be led by or driven by staff. It has to be a combined and collaborative exercise between governing body members and officers, bringing in, where appropriate, external sources of advice to strengthen the assurance that the evidence bank provides. But the evidence bank in itself should be something that works for you, that can be interrogated, and that draws together all of the resources that you already have access to within your organisation. So some specifics, and I'm not going to dwell too much on this because I think Alex has already covered most of this in his presentation very helpfully. But for 2021 in particular, bearing in mind that this is a kind of overlay on top of the assurance state that you already maintain, I think it's really important to be looking at particular aspects of the business's activities. Tenant and resident safety, obviously, not just in terms of things like the fire safety regulations, but particularly in terms of the impact of delayed repairs, the impact of not being able to carry out adaptations, for example, making sure that there aren't increased risks to tenant and resident safety by catch-up programmes being adversely impacted by recovery plans. Looking particularly again at service delivery and recovery, this emphasis I think has to be on recovery. But how do you ensure that service delivery catches up in terms of being accessible to tenants, being responsive to tenants' demands, but moving with the times? And I think some of that is about learning from the experience of the last year and working out what you're going to take forward into the future, as well as what you're going to leave behind. Some of the next two headings here, financial viability and business planning, are really allusions to the work that everybody has been doing to update their business plans, to take account of the last year, to take account of the experience of the last year and the impact that might have on your ability to do what you want to do, or the ways in which you want to do what you're doing. I think from committee members, board members' perspectives, it will be important to have a particular look, or be assured is probably a better way of putting it, to be assured about staff well-being. Because I think many of the points that Alex was making about remote working, about isolation, about the impact that has, the staff well-being, or any adverse impact on staff well-being has on their ability to continue to deliver services to tenants, has to be a source of concern. It's clearly an area of risk, and it's something that governing body members, I think, need to be looking at very carefully over the course of this coming year. The impact on governance. Has governance continued to be as robust as it needs to be, or does it need to be more robust in different areas? And the assurance exercise, I would suggest, needs to look particularly at how well governance has been sustained over the course of the last year, and how that will be promoted during the course of the coming year. And tenant engagements in a similar vein. I think tenant engagement is always critical. I think lots of housing associations and co-ops have managed to engage more effectively with tenants over the course of the last year. How are you going to sustain that going forward? And how have those organisations who've lost contact with some tenants for various reasons, how are they going to be able to re-engage going forward? It takes us on to the final element of risk, which is really what Alex was talking about, and I think what assurance is about too, because it seems to me that robust assurance is a very good tool for managing risk. And because if you are looking comprehensively at all aspects of the organisation and its governance, then you are going to be able to minimise risk. And the 2021 assurance process and the assurance exercise should certainly support a fairly clear assessment of the extent to which either risks have been increased or mitigated going forward. So, important to remember I think five points it's important to remember. Assurance and compliance should be continuous. It's not a one-off exercise. Yes, there is an annual assurance statement that has to be submitted, but that should be at the point in a circular process. It's not something that has a start and an end point. The focus for an organisation should be on gaining and maintaining assurance and demonstrating and evidencing compliance, not on the process that supports the publication of an annual assurance statement. Those processes support assurance and compliance, but they're not the ends in themselves. And I think that's probably the biggest area of worry that I have in governance terms, that the annual assurance statement and the process to produce it is a process. It's something that's there for that. That's the objective, rather than the objective being robust assurance about the strength and health of the organisation. It's the governing body that needs to be assured. I think that's really important, and officers are there to support and deliver that assurance, but it's the governing body who needs to be assured. And the role of staff is to help governing body members make use of the resources that are available and to interrogate the evidence that's there, and to bring in, with the agreement and active involvement of the governing body, any additional external sources of information that are needed to strengthen the level of assurance that they have. But the governing body needs to have access to sufficient information and insight to support their assurance, which is why the ability to independently trawl through the evidence bank is so important. And at the end of the day, it's the staff contribution and the governance structures that support these processes and deliver the assurance, but the focus has to be on the assurance overall within an organisation, and it's that which then enables an organisation, a governing body, to sign off on an annual assurance statement. But that's not the end. That's just a point in the year, and things roll on from there on. So that's a bit of a wander through what assurance is about, and trying to link it to what's in the toolkit. The toolkit is substantially unaltered from previous versions, but it has been modified to reflect the particular circumstances of this year and some of the changes that have been introduced and are going to be introduced. But just to finish on that point, we have anticipated the publication of the guidance on equalities and human rights. So when you look at, for example, the suggested clause that could go into an annual assurance statement to cover the work that an RSL is doing to work towards satisfying the new requirements, that's going to look a bit strange just now, because people will quite rightly say, but we don't know what the requirements are because the guidance isn't out. Understand that, but the guidance in the toolkit that was published yesterday is probably, in that respect, maybe a little while ahead of the world, because we don't yet have the guidance. I just want to allay any concerns there that that's anticipatory rather than a statement of where we are just now. So happy to take any questions or comments that people have. And I'm just going to stop sharing my screen just now so that it makes it easier for people to participate.
Thanks very much for that, Linda.